I visited my grandma without telling anyone. The moment she opened the front door, every bit of color drained from her face. Before I could even smile or say hello, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength, dragged me down the creaking basement stairs, and whispered, "If your father finds you here, he'll destroy everything." The old wooden door slammed shut above us. I stood there in the dim light, surrounded by dusty shelves, forgotten photo albums, and the smell of damp concrete. My heart pounded so loudly I barely heard the sound of a truck stopping outside. Grandma's hands were shaking. She wasn't afraid for herself. She was afraid for me. For 28 years, I believed my father was a respected businessman who sacrificed everything for our family. He taught me that loyalty mattered more than money and that Grandma had become confused after Grandpa died. He said she pushed everyone away, so I stopped visiting as often as I should have. That lie had stolen years from us. Footsteps echoed across the porch above. A car door slammed. Then I heard the voice I had known my entire life. My father's. "Mom," he called. "I know someone's here." Grandma squeezed my arm until it hurt. Her eyes filled with tears as she pointed toward an old steel filing cabinet hidden behind dusty boxes. "Everything he's afraid of," she whispered, barely breathing. "It's in there." For the first time in my life, I realized my father wasn't protecting our family from the truth. He was protecting the truth from me. My name is Ethan, and for most of my life, I believed my father was the strongest man I knew. He owned a successful construction company, spoke with quiet confidence, and carried the kind of reputation that made people stand a little straighter. When he entered a room, I never questioned him because everyone else trusted him first. After my mother died when I was 12, he became my entire world. He decided where we lived, who we spent time with, and which relatives were bad influences. Whenever I asked about Grandma, he would sigh and say she was grieving too hard, that she blamed everyone for Grandpa's death, and that visiting her only reopened old wounds. I accepted that explanation because children rarely imagine the person raising them is also rewriting their memories. I grew into the dependable son he wanted. I worked long hours in the family business, solved problems without asking for credit, and quietly cleaned up mistakes made by managers who earned twice my salary. My father praised my loyalty in public, but never trusted me with important decisions. Promotions always went to people who admired him instead of people who challenged him. Looking back, I realized he wasn't overlooking me because I lacked ability. He was making sure I never stood close enough to see what he was hiding. The only person who never treated me like a tool was Grandma. Even after years of distance, she greeted every birthday with a handwritten card. My father insisted they were guilt trips, and usually threw them away before I could read them. I didn't know then that every missing letter was another piece of my family's real story disappearing before it ever reached me. Standing in Grandma's basement, I finally understood why so many moments from my childhood had never quite fit together. They hadn't been random misunderstandings. They had been carefully arranged, one quiet betrayal at a time. My father never raised his voice when he erased people from my life. He didn't have to. At family dinners, if Grandma's name came up, he'd simply pause, lower his eyes and say, "Let's not ruin the evening." The room would fall silent, and everyone would move on. As a kid, I mistook that silence for respect. Now I recognized it as obedience. There were other moments I had ignored. Birthday parties where every aunt and uncle seemed uncomfortable. Whenever I asked why Grandma wasn't invited. Holidays where my cousins exchanged quick glances before changing the subject. Even Grandpa's old photographs slowly disappeared from the walls, replaced by expensive paintings that carried no memories at all. At work, the pattern continued. Whenever I proposed an idea that could improve the company, my father would nod thoughtfully, then present the same plan weeks later as his own. During meetings, he introduced me as my reliable son instead of by my position, as if my only value was following instructions. Clients complimented my work, but they always looked to him for approval before speaking another word. None of those moments seemed cruel on their own. They were too polished, too ordinary, but standing beneath that old house, listening to my father's footsteps moving across the floor above me, I realized those quiet dismissals had never been accidents. They were rehearsals, small, careful ways of teaching everyone, including me, that only his version of the truth deserved to survive. Grandma waited until my father's truck pulled away. Before unlocking the steel filing cabinet, the rusty latch clicked open, and she carefully lifted out a weathered accordion folder wrapped in a faded blue towel. She handled it the way people carry something fragile, not because it might break, but because of everything it contains. Inside were letters, bank records, property deeds, and copies of court filings dating back nearly 20 years. None of them told one dramatic story. Together they told a devastating one. My father hadn't simply distanced me from Grandma. After Grandpa died, he quietly convinced the rest of the family that she was mentally unstable. While everyone accepted his version of events, he transferred business assets into companies he secretly controlled, pressured relatives into signing documents they barely understood, and isolated the only person who kept copies of the original records. Then Grandma handed me the last envelope. It was addressed to me in Grandpa's handwriting. The letter explained that Grandpa had intentionally left me a future ownership interest in the family land, not because I was his favorite, but because he believed I would protect the family from greed. He also wrote that if I was reading the letter years later instead of weeks after his death, someone had made sure it never reached me. I folded the letter carefully and looked back at the stacks of evidence. For the first time, revenge didn't feel like exposing my father in front of everyone or making him suffer the way he had made Grandma suffer. It felt quieter than that. He had spent 2 decades building his life on documents, reputation, and carefully controlled stories. I wasn't going to argue with his lies. I was going to replace them with the truth, one verified record at a time. I resisted every instinct to confront my father that same evening. For years, he had controlled every conversation by staying calm, while everyone else reacted emotionally. Walking into his office with a folder of accusations would only give him another opportunity to dismiss me as confused or manipulated. Instead, I started doing something he had never expected. I verified everything. The engineering degree I had earned before joining the family company had taught me to trust evidence over assumptions. That habit became my greatest advantage. Every document Grandma had saved was scanned, catalogued, and matched against public property records, corporate filings, and archived financial statements. Whenever dates overlapped or signatures appeared suspicious, I made careful notes instead of jumping to conclusions. I also contacted an experienced estate attorney, not to file a lawsuit immediately, but to understand exactly which records could be authenticated and which claims could actually be proven. The attorney's advice was simple. Facts move courts, while emotions only fill conversations. That sentence stayed with me. For several weeks, I behaved exactly as my father expected. I arrived at work on time, managed projects, attended meetings, and never hinted that anything had changed. He continued treating me as the dependable son who asked few questions. Every confident smile he gave me revealed just how secure he believed his secrets still were. Meanwhile, copies of every verified document were stored in multiple secure locations. The originals never left Grandma's house. By the time my father noticed I had stopped seeking his approval, I wasn't preparing an argument anymore. I was preparing a timeline, one built entirely on records he had created himself, and one that would be impossible to explain away when the right people finally saw it. The opportunity arrived 3 months later at the company's annual board meeting. It was the one day each year when shareholders, accountants, legal advisors, and senior managers gathered in the same room to review the business my grandfather had built. My father stood at the front with the same calm confidence he had carried my entire life. He spoke about integrity, family values, and protecting the company's legacy. Around the table, people nodded without hesitation. I waited until he finished. When the chair invited questions, I didn't accuse anyone. I simply handed every board member a neatly organized binder. Each section contained certified copies of property records, corporate filings, dated correspondence, and Grandpa's original estate instructions. Every page was cross-referenced. Every claim pointed to documented evidence instead of opinion. The room grew unusually quiet. No one interrupted. No one argued. The company's outside attorney slowly turned page after page, before looking toward my father, not with anger, but with confusion. The silence that followed was heavier than any shouted argument could have been. For the first time, my father had no story prepared. He asked for a private discussion. The board declined. He insisted the documents were misunderstood. The attorney requested an independent forensic review before another word was spoken. Within days, several asset transfers were frozen pending investigation. The board suspended my father from executive authority until the records could be verified. Reporters never needed dramatic headlines because the official filings spoke for themselves. I didn't celebrate when he walked out carrying a single cardboard box. I looked across the parking lot where Grandma was waiting inside my car. She smiled, not because her son had fallen, but because after 20 years, The truth had finally entered the room without raising its voice. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic confrontations, no emotional speeches, and no relatives suddenly pretending they had known the truth all along. Real consequences moved slowly, carried by paperwork, meetings, and difficult conversations that could no longer be avoided. Several family members came to see Grandma for the first time in years. They arrived awkwardly, carrying flowers or homemade food, unsure whether an apology could bridge 2 decades of silence. Grandma welcomed each of them without bitterness. She answered their questions honestly, but she never asked them to choose sides. Watching her respond with grace made me realize strength isn't measured by how long you can hold on to anger, but by knowing when to let it go. At the company, employees stopped lowering their voices when I walked past. Many admitted they had noticed irregular decisions over the years but had assumed they were part of responsibilities they didn't understand, respect that had once belonged to my father. Because of his position slowly shifted toward those willing to protect the company's integrity, instead of a single person's reputation. My relationship with my father became distant, defined only by attorneys and necessary documents. That hurt more than I expected. Losing the man I believed he was felt heavier than exposing the man he had become. But perhaps that's why this story matters. The greatest betrayal isn't always a stolen inheritance or hidden money. Sometimes it's allowing someone else to write your memories until you no longer trust your own. The day I chose evidence over fear, I didn't just reclaim my grandfather's legacy, I reclaimed my own life. People sometimes ask whether I regret uncovering the truth. The honest answer is that I regret needing to. There is no victory in discovering that someone you admired built their life on deception. The victory comes later, when you decide their choices will no longer define your own. Grandma and I rebuilt the years we lost one ordinary afternoon at a time. We shared coffee on her porch, sorted through old family photographs, and laughed over stories Grandpa had written in the margins of his notebooks. Those quiet moments became worth more than any piece of land or any position at the company. They were the inheritance my father could never steal. The business eventually recovered under new leadership. I accepted a seat on the board, not because I wanted power, but because I understood how easily trust can be abused when good people stop asking difficult questions. Transparency became our strongest policy, and every major decision was documented so no future generation would have to rely on someone's version of history. As for my father, time accomplished what anger never could. His reputation wasn't destroyed by my words. It was rewritten by his own actions. I stopped waiting for an apology that might never come, because peace doesn't begin when someone admits they hurt you. It begins when you no longer need their permission to move forward. Sometimes I still visit Grandma's basement. The old filing cabinet is still there, but it no longer feels like a place where secrets are hidden. It reminds me that the truth can stay buried for years and still find its way into the light. And I learned the most important lesson of all. The quietest revenge isn't making someone lose everything. It is making sure they can never steal who you are again.